The pickup truck's engine coughed like an old man with too many cigarettes behind him as Marcus Thornton guided it down the winding dirt road toward his ranch. Dust clouds followed him like loyal dogs, settling on everything within 50 yards. He'd been making this same drive for 15 years now, ever since his father passed and left him the sprawling cattle operation in the middle of nowhere, Montana. Marcus was 42 years old and looked every day of it. His hands were carved leather from years of handling barbed wire and wrestling stubborn cattle. His face carried permanent lines from squinting against prairie sun and wind. The mirror in his bathroom showed him a man who'd forgotten how to smile, though he couldn't remember exactly when that happened. The last woman to set foot on his property had been Mrs. Henderson from the neighboring ranch, and that was 3 years ago when she brought him a casserole after he'd broken his arm in a fall from his horse. She was 74 years old and treated him like the grandson she never had. Before that, well, Marcus tried not to think about before that. Sarah had left on a Tuesday morning in October. She'd packed her bags while he was out checking the south pasture, and when he came back for lunch, he found a note on the kitchen table. "I can't do this anymore," it read. "The isolation is killing me slowly. I need people. Marcus, I need a life." She'd been gone by the time he finished reading it twice. That was 15 winters ago, and Marcus had stopped counting after 10. His ranch house sat like a weathered giant at the end of the dirt road, surrounded by thousands of acres of rolling grassland that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The nearest neighbor was 12 miles away. The nearest town was 37 miles, and it barely qualified as a town with its population of 412 souls. Marcus pulled up to his usual parking spot beside the house and cut the engine. The silence that followed was so complete it had weight. No traffic sounds, no neighbor's lawnmower, no children playing in distant yards. Just wind through grass and the occasional complaint from one of his cattle scattered across the range. He'd driven to town that morning to pick up supplies from Henderson's general store. Feed for the horses, medicine for a sick calf, and groceries for himself that would last 2 weeks if he stretched them right. The routine never changed much. Drive to town once every 2 weeks, stock up, drive back, and settle into another 14 days of solitude. Martha Henderson had tried again to convince him to join the church social on Sunday. "There's some nice single ladies there. Marcus," she'd said while ringing up his purchases. "Rebecca Thompson just moved back from Denver after a divorce. She's looking for a fresh start." Marcus had nodded politely and paid for his goods without commenting. Martha meant well, but she didn't understand. After 15 years alone, a man gets used to his own company. He gets used to eating dinner in silence, talking only to his horses and cattle, and falling asleep to nothing but wind and the distant calls of coyotes. The ranch work kept him busy enough. 700 head of cattle didn't manage themselves, and Marcus ran the operation single-handed except during roundup season when he hired temporary help from town. The work was hard and never-ending, which suited him fine. Tired men don't have energy left for loneliness. He unloaded his supplies and carried them into the house. The kitchen was clean but sparse, functional rather than welcoming. Everything had its place, and everything stayed in its place because there was no one around to move it. The refrigerator held basics: milk that would last a week, eggs, cheese, sandwich meat, and leftover stew from 3 days ago. Marcus put away his groceries with the efficiency of long practice. Canned goods in the pantry, frozen items in the freezer, perishables arranged by expiration date in the refrigerator. He learned to waste nothing because the next trip to town was always 2 weeks away. The afternoon was spent checking on his cattle in the east pasture. He rode his horse Thunder, a 9-year-old quarter horse with more sense than most people Marcus had known. They moved through the herd slowly, looking for signs of injury or illness. The cattle were doing well on the spring grass, and the new calves were growing strong. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Marcus turned Thunder back toward the barn. The evening routine was as fixed as everything else in his life. Feed the horses, check the water trough, secure the barn, eat dinner, and settle in for another quiet night. He was unsaddling Thunder when he heard something that made him freeze. The sound of a car engine, growing louder as it approached his ranch. Marcus couldn't remember the last time someone had driven out to see him unannounced. He finished with Thunder and walked outside, shading his eyes against the setting sun. A yellow taxi was making its way down his dirt road, moving slowly to avoid the worst of the potholes. Marcus watched in bewilderment as it pulled up beside his house and stopped. The dust cloud caught up and settled around both vehicles like a stage curtain. The taxi driver, a thin man with nervous eyes, got out first. He looked around at the vast emptiness surrounding them and shook his head. "This is definitely the middle of nowhere," he muttered, loud enough for Marcus to hear. Then the passenger door opened, and Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, like a foundation settling after years of being solid. A woman stepped out of the taxi. She was young, maybe late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and wearing a modest blue dress that had seen better days. She carried a single small suitcase and a worn leather purse. But it was her eyes that caught Marcus's attention. They were the kind of brown that reminded him of rich coffee, and they held a determination that seemed at odds with her obvious nervousness. The taxi driver was pulling more luggage from the trunk. 3 more bags, all of them looking like they contained everything a person owned in the world. The woman stood beside the car, looking around at the endless grassland and the distant mountains with an expression Marcus couldn't read. "Excuse me," she called out to Marcus, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Are you Marcus Thornton?" Marcus found himself walking toward her before he consciously decided to move. "Yes, ma'am, I am." She smiled then, and it transformed her entire face. "Emelina Vasquez. I'm your bride." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He stopped walking and stared at her, certain he'd misunderstood. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "I'm your bride," she repeated, her smile faltering slightly. "Through the Frontier Marriages Agency. We've been corresponding for 3 months. Marcus felt the world tilt sideways. "I think there's been a mistake, miss. I haven't been corresponding with anyone about marriage or anything else." The taxi driver chose that moment to interrupt. "Look, folks, I've driven 300 miles to get here, and my meter's running. Someone needs to pay me, and then I need to start back before it gets dark." Elena turned to the driver with growing alarm in her voice. "Please, just wait a moment. There seems to be some confusion." She pulled a stack of letters from her purse, tied with a blue ribbon. "These are your letters, Mr. Thornton. You wrote to me about wanting a wife to share your ranch life. You said you were tired of being alone and that you had a good home to offer the right woman." Marcus took the letters with hands that weren't quite steady. The return address on the envelopes was definitely his ranch, and the handwriting looked familiar, though he couldn't immediately place it. He opened the top letter and began reading. "Dear Elena," it began, "your response to my advertisement has brought sunshine into what has been a very lonely life. I run a cattle ranch in Montana, and while the work is hard and the location is isolated, I believe I can offer stability and partnership to a woman who shares my values and isn't afraid of rural life." Marcus read 3 more paragraphs describing his ranch, his daily routine, and his hopes for finding a companion who would appreciate the peace and beauty of prairie life. The signature at the bottom was his own name, written in handwriting that looked exactly like his. But he hadn't written a single word of it. "Ma'am," the taxi driver said again, more insistently, "I need to get paid and get moving." Elena was watching Marcus read the letters, and he could see growing panic in her eyes. "You did write those, didn't you? Please tell me you wrote them." Marcus looked up from the letters to study her face. She was pretty in a quiet way, with high cheekbones and skin that spoke of Hispanic heritage. But more than her looks, there was something in her expression that caught at him. She looked like a person who had taken a tremendous risk and was just beginning to realize it might not pay off. "Miss Vasquez," he said gently, "I honestly don't know how this happened, but I didn't write these letters. I've never contacted any marriage agency." Elena closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. Oh God, I sold everything. My apartment, my furniture, everything. I used the money to pay for the train ticket and the taxi. I don't have anywhere else to go. The taxi driver cleared his throat loudly. Look, I'm sorry about your situation, but I've got a 300-mile drive back to Billings, and I need to leave now. That'll be $420. Elena opened her purse and pulled out a thin envelope. She counted out bills with trembling fingers, clearly most of the cash she had left in the world. The taxi driver took his money and started loading her bags back into his car. Wait, Marcus said, the word coming out sharper than he intended. The driver stopped and looked at him. Elena turned toward him with desperate hope in her eyes. Marcus found himself caught between common sense and something deeper that he couldn't name. Common sense said to let the taxi driver take her back to town, help her contact family or friends, and get this strange situation sorted out by people who understood legal matters and marriage agencies. But something else spoke louder than common sense. She'd sold everything she owned based on letters someone had forged in his name. She'd traveled hundreds of miles to marry a stranger because those letters had convinced her she'd found a man who wanted the same thing she did. And now she was stranded on his ranch with nothing but a few suitcases and the devastating knowledge that she'd been deceived. Leave her bags, Marcus told the taxi driver. Marcus, Elena said softly. You don't have to. Leave her bags, he repeated. She's staying, at least for tonight. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. The taxi driver shrugged and began unloading the luggage again. Marcus pulled out his own wallet and handed the man a $50 bill. For the extra trouble, he said, as the taxi pulled away, leaving a dust cloud that would take 10 minutes to settle. Marcus and Elena stood facing each other in the growing twilight. The silence stretched between them, filled with uncertainty and questions that neither of them knew how to ask. I have a guest room, Marcus said finally. You can stay there tonight, and tomorrow we'll figure out how to contact this marriage agency and get to the bottom of what happened. Elena picked up her smallest suitcase. Thank you, she said quietly. I know this isn't what you planned for your evening. Marcus surprised himself by almost smiling. Ma'am, I haven't had anything unplanned happen in 15 years. I'd forgotten what it felt like. He helped her carry her bags into the house, setting them down in the small guest room that hadn't been used since his father's cousin visited 5 years ago. The room was clean but impersonal, with a single bed, a dresser, and one window that looked out over the north pasture. It's not much, Marcus said, but the bed's comfortable and there are clean sheets. Elena looked around the room and nodded. It's fine. Better than fine, actually. Thank you for not sending me away. They stood in the doorway for a moment, and Marcus found himself really looking at her for the first time since she'd stepped out of the taxi. She was smaller than she'd seemed outside, probably 5'4" to his 6'2". Her dress was well made, but clearly not expensive, and her shoes showed the kind of wear that came from walking everywhere, because owning a car wasn't an option. Are you hungry? He asked. I was about to make dinner. I don't want to impose any more than I already have. Ma'am, you're not imposing. Someone played a cruel joke on both of us, and until we figure out who and why, we're in this together. Elena smiled again, and Marcus felt that same strange, settling sensation in his chest. In that case, yes, I'm starving. I haven't eaten since breakfast. Marcus led her to the kitchen and began pulling ingredients from the refrigerator. Leftover stew could be stretched to feed 2 people, and he had cornbread from yesterday that would warm up fine in the oven. As he worked, Elena sat at the small kitchen table and watched him. How long have you lived here alone? She asked. 15 years, Marcus answered without thinking, then wondered why he'd share that information so readily. That's a long time. It is. Don't you get lonely? Marcus paused in his stirring of the stew. It was a simple question, but no one had asked him that in years. Martha Henderson worried about him being alone, but she'd never directly asked if he was lonely. I got used to it, he said finally. That's not the same thing as not being lonely. Marcus glanced at her, and found her watching him with those coffee-colored eyes. There was understanding in them, and something else he couldn't identify. No, he admitted, it's not the same thing. They ate dinner with surprisingly easy conversation. Elena told him about her life in Phoenix, where she'd worked as a seamstress in a factory until it closed down 3 months ago. She'd been living in a small apartment and sending money to her sick mother in New Mexico when she'd seen the advertisement that had supposedly come from Marcus. The ad said you were looking for a wife who wanted a quiet life away from the city, she explained. Someone who wouldn't mind the isolation as long as she had a good man to share it with. It sounded like exactly what I was looking for. What made you want to leave the city? Marcus asked. Elena was quiet for a moment, pushing stew around on her plate. I grew up on a small ranch in New Mexico. My father raised sheep until he died when I was 16. After that, my mother and I moved to the city so I could find work. But I never stopped missing the wide, open spaces and the peace of rural life. So the isolation wouldn't have bothered you? No, she said softly. I think I would have welcomed it. After dinner, Marcus showed her around the main floor of the house. The living room was comfortable, but masculine, with worn leather furniture and walls lined with books about ranching, animal husbandry, and Western history. The kitchen was larger than it looked, designed for cooking big meals during roundup season when he had hired help staying in the bunkhouse. It's a good house, Elena said as they finished the tour. Solid. It feels like a home. My father built it in 1952, Marcus told her. Said he wanted something that would last long enough for his grandchildren to inherit it. The comment hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither of them was ready to address. Marcus cleared his throat and changed the subject. I'll try to contact the marriage agency tomorrow and see if we can figure out what happened. Someone obviously used my name and address without permission. Do you have any idea who might have done something like this? Marcus thought about it. Not really. I don't have many people in my life who would even know enough about my situation to pull this off. They said good night at the door to the guest room, and Marcus retreated to his own bedroom at the other end of the house. But sleep didn't come easily. He lay in his bed, listening to the sounds of another person in his house. Water running in the guest bathroom. Footsteps crossing the floor. The subtle creaking of a bed accepting someone's weight. He couldn't remember the last time his house had held another human being overnight. Marcus stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of the day's events. Someone had been writing letters in his name for months, convincing a young woman to sell everything she owned and travel hundreds of miles to marry him. It was an elaborate and cruel deception that had hurt Elena badly and put him in an impossible situation. But as he lay there listening to the sounds of occupancy, Marcus realized something that surprised him. For the first time in 15 years, his house didn't feel empty, and that scared him almost as much as it comforted him. Marcus woke at 5 in the morning, the same time he'd awakened every day for 15 years. His internal clock was more reliable than any alarm, trained by decades of cattle that needed feeding and horses that required attention regardless of weather or his personal feelings about getting out of bed. But this morning was different. This morning he lay still for several extra minutes, listening to the foreign sound of another person breathing in his house. Elena was still asleep in the guest room, and Marcus found himself reluctant to begin his normal routine and risk waking her. When he finally got up and padded quietly to the kitchen to start coffee, he discovered she was already awake. She sat at his kitchen table wearing jeans and a simple white blouse, her dark hair braided down her back. She found his spare coffee mug and was holding it in both hands, staring out the window at the sunrise, painting the eastern mountains pink and gold. Morning, Marcus said quietly. Elena turned toward him with a smile that looked a little sad around the edges. Good morning. I hope you don't mind that I made coffee. I've been up since 4:30. Couldn't sleep. I'm not used to this much quiet, she admitted. In Phoenix, there was always traffic noise, sirens, people talking in the courtyard. Here, the silence is so complete, it's almost loud. Marcus poured himself coffee and sat across from her at the table. Most people find it unsettling at first. I like it, Elena said. Once I got used to it. It's just different. They drank their coffee in comfortable silence while the sun climbed higher and began burning off the morning mist from the pastures. Marcus found himself studying Elena's profile as she watched the landscape wake up. There was something peaceful about her presence that he hadn't expected. She didn't fill the silence with nervous chatter or seem to require constant conversation. "I should call that marriage agency this morning," Marcus said eventually. "Frontier Marievzlina Supid." The number is on their letterhead. She pulled the stack of letters from her purse and handed them to him. "I've been thinking about this all night, and I can't figure out who would have done something like this. The letters are too detailed, too personal. Whoever wrote them knows things about your life." Marcus read through more of the letters while Elena made breakfast without being asked. She moved around his kitchen with easy efficiency, finding what she needed and creating a meal that smelled better than anything that had been cooked in his house in years. The letters were indeed detailed. They described his daily routine, his cattle operation, the layout of his house, and even specific incidents like the time his horse had gotten spooked by a rattlesnake and thrown him into a creek. Whoever had written them either knew Marcus very well or had spent considerable time observing his life. "These are too accurate," he said finally. "This isn't someone playing a random prank. This person knows me." Elena set a plate in front of him containing eggs, bacon, and biscuits that were golden brown and still warm from the oven. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Marcus asked, momentarily distracted from the mystery. "My mother. She always said a woman should be able to feed her family properly, no matter how little money she had to work with." Elena sat down with her own plate. "Do you have any close friends? Family members?" Marcus thought about it while he ate. The biscuits were flaky and perfect, better than anything he could get in town. No family left except some distant cousins. As for friends, he paused, realizing how isolated his life had become. "I'm friendly with folks in town, but I wouldn't say I have close friends." "What about hired help? People who work on the ranch. I hire temporary help during roundup season, but it's usually different people each year. Day laborers who need the work." Marcus was quiet for a moment, thinking, "There is one person who knows me well enough to write those letters." "Who?" "Doc Peterson. He's a local veterinarian, but he's also been my closest friend since we were kids. He knows everything about my life, including—" Marcus trailed off, a suspicion beginning to form in his mind. "Including what?" "Including the fact that he's been after me for years to find a wife and stop living like a hermit." Elena raised an eyebrow. "You think your friend wrote those letters?" "It would explain how they're so accurate. And Doc's exactly the type of person who would think this kind of meddling was for my own good." After breakfast, Marcus called the Frontier Marriages Agency from his landline in the living room. Elena sat nearby, close enough to hear both sides of the conversation. "Frontier Marriages, this is Betty speaking." "Ma'am, this is Marcus Thornton from Montana. I need to speak to someone about a situation involving your service." "Of course, Mr. Thornton. How wonderful to hear from you. Is everything all right with Elena? We were so pleased when you two decided to move forward with the marriage." Marcus glanced at Elena, who was listening intently. "Actually, ma'am, that's what I'm calling about. I never contacted your agency. Someone has been impersonating me." There was a long pause. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thornton, but I don't understand. We have 3 months' worth of correspondence from you, along with your signed application and your payment for our services." "What payment?" "The initial fee of $500, sent by money order 3 months ago. Then, the additional $300 you sent last month to cover Elena's travel expenses." Marcus felt his suspicion hardening into certainty. "Ma'am, someone has been using my name and forging my signature. I need you to tell me exactly how you received these payments and correspondence." Betty's voice became more cautious. "Well, all of your letters came by mail, postmarked from your local post office. The money orders were purchased at Henderson's General Store in your town." Henderson's General Store. The same place Marcus bought his supplies every 2 weeks. The same place where Martha Henderson constantly nagged him about finding a wife. "Can you tell me the exact dates those money orders were purchased?" Betty rustled through papers. "The first one was purchased on March 15th. The second on April 20th. Marcus closed his eyes and thought back. March 15th had been a supply run day. So had April 20th. And on both of those days, he'd left his truck unlocked outside the store while he shopped, just like always. In a town of 400 people, nobody worried about theft. Ma'am, I need to ask you something important. In all those letters you received from this person claiming to be me, did they ever mention anyone else? Any names of friends or people in town? Actually, yes. In his second letter, your friend mentioned how much Dr. Peterson supported his decision to find a wife. He said Dr. Peterson had been encouraging him for years to settle down. Marcus opened his eyes and looked at Elena. She was watching him with growing understanding. Ma'am, I need you to understand that Elena is an innocent victim in this. Someone played an elaborate and cruel trick on both of us. What can you do to help her? Oh my goodness, Betty said, her voice full of distress. This is terrible. We've never had anything like this happen before. Of course, we'll refund the fees, but I don't know what else we can do. Elena sold her possessions and used the money for travel, didn't she? Yes, she did. Mr. Thornton, I'm so sorry. Our agency will do everything we can to help, but we're a small business and we don't have resources to compensate her for everything she's lost. Marcus looked at Elena, who was sitting very straight in her chair, trying to maintain her dignity despite the fact that her entire life had been derailed by someone else's deception. Don't worry about the money, Marcus heard himself saying. Just send us copies of all the correspondence and documentation you have. I want to see everything. After he hung up, Marcus and Elena sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Elena spoke. It was your friend, wasn't it? This Dr. Peterson. I think so. And I think I know how he did it. Marcus explained about leaving his truck unlocked outside the general store and how easy it would have been for someone with access to his mail and his signature to forge documents. But why would he do something like this? Why would he hurt me just to meddle in your life? Marcus thought about Doc Peterson, remembering years of conversations about Marcus's isolation and Doc's increasingly frustrated attempts to push him back into the world of the living. Because he thinks I'm wasting my life, Marcus said slowly. Because he's watched me live like a hermit for 15 years, and he's probably convinced himself that desperate measures are justified, even if it means destroying someone else's life. Doc's always been the type of person who thinks the ends justify the means when he's convinced he's helping someone. Marcus stood up and walked to the window, looking out at his cattle scattered across the morning pasture. The question is, what do we do about it? Elena was quiet for a long moment. When Marcus turned back to her, she was studying his face with those perceptive brown eyes. What do you want to do about it? She asked. I want to drive into town and have a very direct conversation with Doc Peterson. And then what? After you've had your conversation, what happens to me? It was the question Marcus had been avoiding since the moment he'd understood the scope of the deception. Elena had sold everything she owned based on forged letters. She'd traveled hundreds of miles to marry a man who didn't exist, at least not in the form she'd been promised. She had no money, no home to return to, and no family capable of helping her start over. I don't know, Marcus admitted. I've been thinking about that too, Elena said softly. All night, actually, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion, which is, maybe your friend did something terrible, but maybe he also did something right. Marcus stared at her. What do you mean? Elena stood up and joined him at the window. Look at this place, Marcus. Look at what you have here. You got a beautiful ranch, a comfortable home, and a good life. But you're living it completely alone, and that seems like such a waste. Elena, I'm not saying you should marry me, she said quickly. I know that would be crazy. We've known each other for less than 24 hours. But I am saying that maybe we shouldn't be so quick to undo everything. Marcus felt something dangerous stirring in his chest. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that maybe I could stay for a while. Not as your wife, but as, I don't know, a friend, a housekeeper, someone who could help around the ranch and keep you company. Elena, you can't build your life around someone else's deception. I'm not building my life around a deception. I'm building it around a choice. She turned to face him fully. I lost everything in Phoenix, but maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. Maybe I needed to lose everything to find something better. Marcus looked down into her earnest face and felt 15 years of carefully maintained emotional distance beginning to crack. You don't know anything about me, he said. For all you know, I could be a terrible person to live with. I could be mean or crazy or have habits that would drive you insane within a week. Elena smiled. Could be. Or you could be exactly the kind of man I've been looking for my entire life. And what kind of man is that? The kind who takes in a stranded stranger without hesitation. The kind who works hard and lives simply and doesn't feel the need to fill every silence with words. Elena's voice grew softer. The kind who's been hurt before, but still has room in his heart for kindness. Marcus felt something inside him that had been frozen for 15 years beginning to thaw. It was terrifying and wonderful and completely unexpected. If you stayed, he said carefully, it would have to be temporary, until you figure out what you really want to do with your life. Of course, in separate bedrooms. Completely separate lives that just happen to share the same house. Absolutely. And if at any point you decide this was a mistake, I'll drive you anywhere you want to go and give you enough money to start over properly. That's very generous. They were standing very close now. Close enough that Marcus could see gold flecks in Elena's brown eyes. Close enough to smell the faint scent of soap and something else that might have been lavender. This is probably the worst idea I've ever had, Marcus said. Probably, Elena agreed. Doc Peterson is going to think his crazy scheme actually worked. We could let him think that. For a while, Marcus realized he was smiling, really smiling, for the first time in longer than he could remember. All right, he said. Let's go to town and have a conversation with Doc Peterson. But we do it together. Together, if we're going to do this thing, whatever this thing is, we do it as a team. Elena's face lit up with genuine happiness. I like that very much. An hour later, they were driving toward town in Marcus's pickup truck. Elena sat beside him, wearing a blue dress and a nervous smile. They'd agreed on a strategy for confronting Doc Peterson, but Marcus could tell she was worried about how the confrontation would go. He's not a bad man, Marcus told her as they drove. Misguided, maybe, and definitely too fond of meddling in other people's business, but not bad. I hope you're right. Even if I'm wrong, it doesn't change anything. You're not alone in this anymore. Elena looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Is that what this is? You taking care of me because you feel responsible? Marcus considered the question seriously. Maybe it started that way, but it's not ending that way. What is it ending as? I don't know yet, Marcus admitted, but I'm curious to find out. They drove the rest of the way to town in comfortable silence, both of them lost in thought about the strange turn their lives had taken. As they pulled up in front of Doc Peterson's veterinary clinic, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He felt hopeful, and that scared him more than anything else that had happened since Helena stepped out of that taxi, because hope was a dangerous thing for a man who'd spent 15 years learning to live without it. Dr. Samuel Peterson looked up from his examination of a border collie when Marcus and Elena walked into his clinic. His weathered face broke into a huge grin, and he set down his stethoscope to clap his hands together. Well, I'll be damned, Doc said, his eyes twinkling with mischief. You must be the lovely Elena. Marcus, you old dog, you didn't tell me she was this pretty. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. Hello, document. We need to talk. Of course you do. Congratulations, both of you. I have to say, this is the happiest I've seen Marcus look in 15 years. Doc wiped his hands on a towel and came around the examination table. Mrs. Patterson, would you mind waiting in the lobby with Bandit here? I'd like to chat with these folks for a few minutes. After Mrs. Patterson left with her dog, Doc turned back to Marcus and Elena with a satisfied expression. So, how are you two getting along? Better than expected, I hope. Cut the act, Sam, Marcus said quietly. We know what you did. Doc's grin faltered slightly. What I did? Marcus, I don't know what you're talking about. Elena stepped forward, her voice steady but cold. Dr. Peterson, I spent 3 months corresponding with someone I thought was Marcus. Someone who convinced me to sell everything I owned and travel 800 miles to marry a man I'd never met. Someone who signed Marcus's name to letters he never wrote and forged his signature on legal documents. Doc's face went through several changes of expression before settling on something that might have been shame. Elena, I can explain. You can explain how you stole $800 from my life savings? Elena's voice was rising now. You can explain how you convinced me to give up my job, my apartment, and my entire life based on lies. Now hold on just a minute, Doc said, his defensive instincts kicking in. I was trying to help both of you. Marcus, you've been living like a hermit for 15 years, refusing every attempt to get you back into the world. And, Elena, you answered that advertisement because you wanted a different life. I just facilitated things. Marcus stepped closer to his oldest friend, and Doc actually took a step backward at the expression on his face. You facilitated things by committing mail fraud, forgery, and theft, Marcus said. You ruined this woman's life to play matchmaker. Her life isn't ruined. Doc protested. Look at her. Look at you. You're both here together, aren't you? You could have sent her packing yesterday, but you didn't. That tells me something. It tells you that Marcus is a decent human being who wouldn't abandon someone in need, Elena said. It doesn't tell you anything about whether your scheme worked. Doc looked back and forth between them, and Marcus could see him trying to read the situation. Are you telling me there's nothing between you two? No connection at all. Marcus felt Elena's eyes on him, but he kept his gaze fixed on document. That's not the point, Sam. The point is that you had no right to make that choice for either of us. I've been watching you waste away for 15 years, Marcus. 15 years. You're 42 years old, and you live like you're dead already. Someone had to do something. And what about Elena? Did someone have to do something for her too? Or was she just collateral damage in your grand plan to fix my life? Doc's face reddened. I researched her carefully. She was perfect for you. A good woman from a rural background who wanted a quiet life away from the city. She wasn't happy in Phoenix, and she needed a fresh start just as much as you did. You researched her? Elena's voice was dangerously quiet. What exactly does that mean? Doc shifted uncomfortably. I contacted the marriage agency and looked through their files. I found several women who might be compatible with Marcus, but you were clearly the best match. Your background, your values, your situation, everything pointed to you being exactly what Marcus needed. What Marcus needed, Elena repeated. And what about what I needed? Did that factor into your calculations at all? You needed a good man and a stable life, Doc said. Marcus could provide both of those things. Marcus watched Elena's face cycle through anger, hurt, and something else that might have been pity. When she spoke again, her voice was calm but final. Dr. Peterson, what you did was wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. You stole money from me. You lied to me for months, and you manipulated both of us for your own purposes. The fact that you think you had good intentions doesn't change any of that. Doc looked to Marcus for support, but Marcus just shook his head. She's right, Sam. What you did was unforgivable. So what happens now? Doc asked. You press charges? Ruin my practice and my reputation over a mistake in judgment. Marcus and Elena exchanged a look, and in that moment, Marcus realized they'd become a team without either of them explicitly deciding to do so. What happens now, Elena said, is that you're going to make this right. You're going to contact Frontier Marriages and explain what you did. You're going to arrange for a full refund of all fees paid. And you're going to compensate me for the money I lost when I sold my possessions. Elena, furthermore, she continued, you're going to write letters of apology to both of us, acknowledging what you did and taking full responsibility for the deception. And you're going to promise, in writing, never to interfere in Marcus's personal life again. Doc looked stunned. And if I do all of that, you won't press charges? Marcus answered this time. If you do all of that, and if you do it sincerely, we'll consider the matter closed between us. But our friendship is over, Sam. I can't trust you anymore. Doc's face crumpled slightly. Marcus, we've been friends since we were kids. Exactly, which makes what you did even worse. Marcus felt a stab of pain saying it, but he knew it was true. Friends don't manipulate each other's lives like this, no matter how good their intentions are. They left Doc Peterson's clinic 10 minutes later with his promise to make financial restitution and his written apology. As they drove back toward the ranch, Elena was quiet for a long time. "Are you all right?" Marcus asked finally. "I keep thinking about what he said, about researching me like I was a problem to be solved instead of a person with my own hopes and dreams." Elena stared out the window at the passing landscape. "It makes everything feel tainted somehow. The way we met was tainted," Marcus said. "But that doesn't have to taint what comes next." Elena turned to look at him. "What do you think comes next?" Marcus pulled the truck over to the side of the road and shifted in a park. They were on a hill overlooking the valley that held his ranch, and the view stretched for miles in every direction. "I think," Marcus said slowly, "that we start over. Right here, right now." "What do you mean?" Marcus turned to face her fully. "I mean, we forget about the letters and the marriage agency and Doc Peterson's schemes. We pretend we just met, and we decide what we want to do about that." Elena smiled for the first time since they'd left Doc's clinic. "Hi," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Elena Vasquez. I'm a seamstress from Phoenix who's looking for a fresh start somewhere quiet." Marcus shook her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin and the calluses that spoke of honest work. "I'm Marcus Torrenton. I run a cattle ranch about 10 miles from here. I live alone, and I've gotten pretty good at it, but lately I've been thinking that maybe good enough isn't the same as happy." "It's nice to meet you, Marcus. Elena, would you like to come out to my ranch and see if you think you could be happy there? Not as my wife," he added quickly, "but as, well, we'd figure out the details as we went along." "I'd like that very much." They drove the rest of the way to the ranch with a lightness between them that hadn't been there before. The deception that had brought them together was painful, but it was also in the past. What mattered now was what they chose to build from this moment forward. Over the following weeks, they settled into a routine that worked surprisingly well. Elena proved to be an excellent cook and an enthusiastic helper with the ranch work. She learned to ride Thunder's gentle stablemate, a mare named Sunshine, and she took over the vegetable garden that Marcus's father had started, but Marcus had let go to weeds. In the evenings, they would sit on the front porch and talk about their days, their past experiences, and their hopes for the future. Elena told him about growing up on her father's sheep ranch and how much she'd missed the rhythm of rural life. Marcus found himself sharing memories he hadn't spoken aloud in years. "I used to love this place unconditionally," he told her one evening as they watched the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. "After Sarah left, I kept loving it, but it felt different, lonelier. And now?" Marcus considered the question seriously. "Now it feels like home again, like a place meant to be shared." Elena was quiet for a moment, then said, "Marcus, can I tell you something?" "Of course." "I was scared when I decided to answer that marriage advertisement. Terrified, actually. The idea of marrying a stranger and moving somewhere I'd never been went against everything I've been taught about being sensible and careful." "What made you do it anyway?" "Because I realized that being sensible and careful hadn't made me happy. I was 28 years old, working in a factory job I hated, living in a tiny apartment in a city that felt like it was swallowing me alive. The only person I was close to was my mother, and she was 300 miles away, dying slowly of diabetes." Elena's voice grew soft with memory. "When I read those letters, even though they were lies, they described the kind of life I'd been dreaming about since I was 16 years old. A quiet place with wide open spaces and a man who valued partnership over passion." "Partnership over passion? Don't misunderstand me. I'm not against passion. But I grew up watching my parents' marriage, and what made it work wasn't just that they were attracted to each other. It was that they were a team. They worked toward the same goals. They supported each other through hard times, and they genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Marcus felt something settle into place in his chest, like a puzzle piece finding its proper spot. Is that what we have? A partnership? Elena turned to look at him, and in the fading light, her eyes looked almost black. I think we're building toward one. 3 months after Elena's arrival, Marcus woke up one morning to the sound of her singing in the kitchen. It was a song in Spanish that he didn't understand, but her voice was clear and sweet, and it filled the house with a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. He lay in bed for a few extra minutes, just listening, and realized that the hollowness that had lived in his chest for 15 years was gone. In its place was something he'd almost forgotten how to recognize: contentment. When he finally got up and went to the kitchen, Elena was making pancakes and humming under her breath. She looked up when he entered and smiled the kind of smile that made her whole face light up. "Good morning," she said. "I was thinking we should ride out to the south pasture today and check on those new calves." Well, yes, unless you'd rather go alone." Marcus poured himself coffee and sat at the table where Elena had already set out plates and silverware. "I wouldn't rather go alone. I haven't preferred going alone for quite a while now." Elena set a plate of pancakes in front of him, and as she did, her hand brushed against his shoulder. It was a casual touch, the kind of contact that happens naturally between people who are comfortable with each other, but it sent warmth through Marcus like he'd stepped into sunshine. "Elena," he said quietly. "Yes, I've been thinking about something." She sat down across from him with her own breakfast. "What kind of something?" Marcus took a breath and dove in. "I've been thinking that maybe we should make this arrangement permanent." Elena's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. "Permanent how?" "Marié permanent." The silence that followed lasted long enough for Marcus to wonder if he'd made a terrible mistake. Then Elena set down her fork and looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. "Are you proposing to me, Marcus Thornton?" "I'm proposing a practical partnership with someone I've come to care about very much. Someone who fits into my life like she was always meant to be here." That's possibly the least romantic proposal in the history of marriage. Marcus felt his heart sink. "Elena, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to assume." "Stop," Elena said, holding up her hand. "I wasn't complaining. I was observing." She stood up and walked around the table to where Marcus sat. He turned to face her, and she reached out to touch his cheek with gentle fingers. "I grew up believing that the best marriages are built on friendship and partnership and genuine affection," she said. "I've never wanted passionate romance as much as I've wanted someone who would be my partner in building a good life. And I can't think of anyone I'd rather build a life with than you." Marcus stood up so they were facing each other in the morning light streaming through the kitchen window. "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes." He kissed her then, a gentle kiss that tasted like maple syrup and new beginnings. When they broke apart, Elena was smiling. "Should we drive to town and tell Doc Peterson?" she asked with mischief in her eyes. Marcus laughed, a sound he was still getting used to making again. "Let's let him think he won. It'll drive him crazy not knowing whether his scheme actually worked or whether we figured things out for ourselves." "I like the way you think, future husband." 6 months later, Marcus and Elena were married in a simple ceremony at the little church in town. Doc Peterson attended despite the awkwardness between them, and Martha Henderson cried through the entire service. Elena wore a dress she'd sewn herself, and Marcus wore the only suit he owned, which had belonged to his father. They honeymooned at the ranch, spending a week doing nothing but enjoying each other's company and working together to prepare the vegetable garden for winter. On their last evening as newlyweds, they sat on the front porch and watched the stars emerge in the clear Montana sky. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if that taxi driver had gotten lost and taken me to the wrong ranch?" Elena asked. Marcus considered this. "I think somehow you would have found your way here eventually." "You really believe that?" "I believe that some things are meant to be, even when they happen in the most unlikely ways." Elena leaned against Marcus's shoulder, and he wrapped his arms around her. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and somewhere in the darkness, his cattle settled in for the night. For the first time in 15 years, Marcus Thornton was exactly where he belonged, with exactly the right person. The misdelivered bride had turned out to be the right bride after all, just delivered by the wrong means. And if Doc Peterson wanted to take credit for their happiness, Marcus thought he just might let him.